The crisp new uniform felt strange on Marcus's shoulders, the weight of the badge unfamiliar against his chest. He adjusted the collar, the starched fabric a stark contrast to the worn leather jacket he usually favored. He stared at his reflection in the dusty mirror of the chief's office, barely recognizing the determined young man staring back. Chief of Police. Chief. The word echoed in his mind, a title that still felt too big, too soon. At 32, he was the youngest chief this sleepy town of Oakhaven had ever seen. Ambitious, driven, and with a reputation for unwavering integrity, Marcus had risen through the ranks quickly, fueled by a burning desire to make a difference. But Oakhaven was different. Beneath the quaint facade of picket fences and friendly smiles, a darkness lurked. He'd heard the whispers, rumors of corruption, of a brotherhood within the department that protected its own, no matter the cost. His predecessor, a grizzled veteran named Chief Thompson, had warned him with a weary sigh, "This town has its secrets, Marcus. Some things are best left undisturbed." But Marcus wasn't one to back down from a challenge. He'd taken this job to clean up Oakhaven, to restore trust in a badge tarnished by shadows. His first week had been a whirlwind of introductions and forced smiles. The officers, mostly older men with hardened eyes and wary expressions, treated him with a deference that felt laced with resentment. He sensed their scrutiny, their silent judgment of his youth and his outsider status. He knew he had to tread carefully, earn their respect, and expose the rot from within. Later that evening, Marcus decided to patrol the town himself, get a feel for the pulse of Oakhaven after dark. He cruised down Main Street, the neon lights of the diner casting long shadows across the deserted sidewalks. A flicker of movement in the alley caught his eye. He pulled over, stepping out into the cool night air. Two officers, Miller and Davis, familiar faces from the morning briefing, were pinning a young black man against a brick wall. The man's face was contorted in pain, his cries muffled by a hand clamped over his mouth. Marcus watched, hidden in the shadows, as Miller slammed the man's head against the wall, his voice a low growl. "You think you can run your mouth in this town? We'll teach you some respect." Fury surged through Marcus. This wasn't law enforcement. It was brutality, plain and simple. He stepped forward, his voice ringing out in the night. "Officers, what's going on here?" The officers froze, their faces contorted in surprise and a flicker of something else, fear. They turned slowly, their eyes widening as they recognized the new chief. Marcus stepped into the dim light, his expression grim. He knew at that moment that this was just the tip of the iceberg. Oakhaven's secrets were about to be exposed, and he was ready for the fight. The air crackled with a nervous energy, a discordant note in the otherwise joyous symphony of the Oakhaven Summer Festival. The town square, usually a sleepy expanse of green, throbbed with life. Garlands of brightly colored lights strung between the ancient oak trees cast a festive glow on the bustling crowd. The aroma of sizzling hot dogs and sugary funnel cakes mingled with the infectious rhythm of a local band belting out a bluesy tune from a makeshift stage. But beneath the surface of celebration, a current of unease ran through the crowd, like a discordant melody threatening to disrupt the harmony. Marcus, dressed in jeans and a faded t-shirt, blended into the throng, his eyes scanning the faces around him. He'd been in Oakhaven for just a few weeks, but he'd already learned that this town had a knack for hiding its secrets in plain sight. He watched as families strolled hand in hand, their laughter echoing through the square. Children with sticky fingers and painted faces darted between the stalls, their eyes wide with wonder. But every now and then, a glance would linger too long. A whisper would pass between neighbors. A nervous laugh would cut short. Something wasn't right. His gaze settled on a group of young black men gathered near the fountain, their voices raised in playful banter. One of them, tall and lanky with a wide smile, caught his attention. Jamal. Marcus had met him earlier that week, a promising student with dreams of becoming a lawyer. He'd seen the spark of hope in Jamal's eyes, a hope that Marcus feared would be extinguished by the darkness that clung to Oakhaven. Suddenly, the festive music was punctuated by a sharp shout. 3 officers, Miller, Davis, and a newcomer named Johnson, emerged from the crowd, their faces grim. They moved with a practiced efficiency, their hands hovering near their batons. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, a plea of fear spreading through the square. Marcus tensed, his instincts screaming at him to intervene. But he held back, reminding himself of his mission. He needed to observe, to gather evidence, to expose the rot at the core of this town. The officers surrounded Jamal and his friends, their voices harsh and accusatory. "You boys causing trouble here?" Miller sneered, his eyes fixed on Jamal. "We don't take kindly to troublemakers in Oakhaven." Jamal stood tall, his voice steady. "We're not causing any trouble, officer. Just enjoying the festival." But Davis wasn't listening. He lunged forward, grabbing Jamal by the arm and twisting it behind his back. Jamal cried out in pain, his friends stepping forward in protest. Johnson stepped in, his baton raised threateningly. "Back off," he barked. "You want a taste of this?" The crowd watched in stunned silence as the officers dragged Jamal towards a parked police cruiser. They shoved him against the car, his face pressed against the cold metal. Miller produced a pair of handcuffs, his lips curled into a cruel smile. "Let's teach this kid a lesson he won't forget," he muttered, snapping the cuffs around Jamal's wrists. With a sickening clang, the officers chained Jamal to the cruiser. His body slumped against the vehicle, his head bowed in defeat. They stepped back, their laughter echoing through the square, a chilling counterpoint to the festive music. The crowd remained frozen, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and resignation. Marcus watched, his fists clenched, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading, the moment that would define his time in Oakhaven. He knew he couldn't stand by and watch. He had to act. Sarah's fingers trembled as she clutched her phone, the screen reflecting the horror etched on her face. She'd been filming the band, capturing the joyous energy of the festival for her vlog, when the officers stormed in. Her camera had followed them, drawn to the escalating tension, the fear in Jamal's eyes. She'd recorded it all, the brutal takedown, the cruel laughter, the sickening clang of the chains. Now, huddled in a quiet corner of the square, she watched the footage again and again, each replay sending a fresh wave of nausea through her. This wasn't the Oakhaven she knew, the town where everyone smiled and waved, where summer festivals were a celebration of community. This was something ugly, something sinister, something she couldn't ignore. With a surge of adrenaline, she uploaded the video to her social media accounts, adding a simple caption, "This is Oakhaven. This is what they do to us." She hit post, her heart pounding in her chest. Within minutes, the video was being shared, retweeted, and commented on with a fury that took her breath away. Hashtag OakhavenPD, hashtag Justice for Jamal, hashtag Black Lives Matter. The hashtags blazed across her screen, a digital wildfire spreading across the internet. People from all over the country, even the world, were watching, commenting, expressing their outrage. Local news outlets picked up the story, their phone calls flooding the Oakhaven Police Department. Sarah, a shy girl who usually preferred the company of her books to the chaos of social media, found herself thrust into the spotlight. Reporters clamored for interviews, activists reached out in solidarity, and even celebrities shared her video with messages of support. She felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. She'd never intended to become an activist, but she couldn't turn back now. She had a responsibility to Jamal, to her town, to the truth. Meanwhile, Marcus watched the digital storm unfold from his sparsely furnished apartment. He'd changed out of his festival clothes. The image of Jamal chained to the cruiser burned into his mind. He scrolled through the comments, the anger and the calls for justice echoing his own feelings. But there was something else, a thread of fear running through the online conversation. People were scared, not just for Jamal, but for themselves. He knew this incident was more than just a case of police brutality. It was a symptom of a deeper disease, a rot that had festered in Oakhaven for far too long. His undercover investigation had just taken a dangerous turn. The spotlight was now on Oakhaven, and the people he was trying to expose were watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. He had a choice to make. He could stay in the shadows, continue his investigation quietly, and hope to bring down the corrupt officers from within. Or he could step into the light, Use this incident as a catalyst, and risk everything to bring justice to Oakhaven. Marcus looked at his reflection in the window, the city lights painting his face in shades of blue and red. He saw the determination in his eyes, the fire that had driven him to become a police officer in the first place. He knew what he had to do. The video played on a loop in Marcus's mind, Jamal's terrified face, the officer's cruel laughter, the silent, complicit crowd. He paced his apartment, the confines of the small space mirroring the turmoil within him. His instincts screamed at him to storm the police station, badge flashing, and bring those officers down. But a cold, calculating voice whispered a warning. Not yet. He was walking a tightrope. His undercover investigation into Oakhaven's corrupt police force had been meticulously planned. He needed to gather irrefutable evidence, expose the network of corruption that stretched far beyond those 3 officers. This incident, as horrific as it was, could be the key to unraveling it all. But Jamal? He couldn't just stand by and watch an innocent man suffer. He thought of Jamal's bright smile, his ambitious dreams, now overshadowed by fear and injustice. He had to act, but he had to be smart. Marcus grabbed his phone, dialing a number he'd memorized long ago. "Ben," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I need a favor." Ben, a tech whiz and Marcus's oldest friend, was already on it. Within minutes, Marcus had access to the police department's internal server, the officer's body cam footage streaming across his laptop screen. He watched as Miller and Davis bragged about their little prank, their words dripping with venom and racial slurs. Johnson, the rookie, looked uneasy, but he didn't speak up. Divide and conquer, Marcus thought. He knew Johnson was new to the force, eager to prove himself. He could be their weak link. Marcus headed back to the festival, his mind racing with a plan. He found Johnson standing guard near Jamal, his expression a mixture of boredom and unease. Marcus approached him casually, striking up a conversation about the festival, the crowd, the heat. He subtly steered the conversation towards the incident, gauging Johnson's reaction. "Those guys, Miller and Davis," Marcus said, shaking his head, "they can be a bit rough around the edges, huh?" Johnson shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, well, you know how it is. Gotta keep those troublemakers in line." "Sure," Marcus agreed, "but that kid, he didn't seem like much of a threat." Johnson hesitated, then glanced around nervously. "Between you and me," he whispered, "I think they went too far. But what can you do? They're the senior officers." Marcus saw his opening. "You know," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial, "I heard a rumor that the new chief is cracking down on this kind of thing. Zero tolerance for excessive force, especially with all this media attention." Johnson's eyes widened. "Really?" "Yeah," Marcus continued. "And I heard he's looking for officers who are willing to stand up for what's right, officers who aren't afraid to speak out against corruption." He saw the wheels turning in Johnson's head, the conflict between his loyalty to his fellow officers and his desire to do the right thing. Marcus gave him a knowing smile and a pat on the shoulder. "Just something to think about," he said, walking away. The crowd was thinning now, the festive atmosphere replaced by an anxious tension. Marcus made his way towards the cruiser, where Jamal still stood chained, his head bowed. Miller and Davis were nowhere to be seen. This was his chance. He approached Jamal, his voice calm and reassuring. "It's okay," he said. "I'm here to help." Jamal looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. Marcus met his gaze, then turned to address the remaining onlookers. His voice rang out, clear and strong, cutting through the silence. "My name is Marcus Thompson," he announced, "and I'm the chief of police of Oakhaven." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Jamal's eyes widened in disbelief. Marcus reached into his pocket, pulling out S badge and holding it high. He looked at the stunned faces around him, his voice filled with authority. "And I'm here to tell you that this ends now." The air crackled with tension as Marcus entered the precinct. His eyes, narrowed with determination, scanned the room, taking in the faces of his fellow officers. Some avoided his gaze, their expressions unreadable. Others met his stare with defiance, their jaws clenched in anger. Marcus strode to the center of the room, his voice echoing through the silence. I've called this meeting to address the recent events that have tarnished the reputation of this department, he began, his voice firm and unwavering. He spoke of the officers who had been caught on camera brutalizing a young man, their actions a blatant violation of the law and the oath they had sworn to uphold. He spoke of the systemic racism that had festered within the department for far too long, a cancer that had poisoned the very core of their mission. His words were met with a mixture of murmurs and gasps. Some officers nodded in agreement, their faces etched with shame. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting around the room. Marcus pressed on, his voice rising in intensity. "We cannot stand by and allow this to continue," he declared. "We must hold ourselves accountable for our actions. We must root out the racism and prejudice that has stained our ranks." His words resonated with some officers, but others bristled with resentment. They saw Marcus as an outsider, a threat to their way of life. They muttered amongst themselves, their voices laced with hostility. One officer, a burly man with a thick mustache, stepped forward. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" he snarled, his face contorted in rage. "You think you can come in here and dictate to us how to do our jobs?" Marcus met his gaze unflinchingly. "I'm not here to dictate," he replied calmly. "I'm here to lead. I'm here to make this department what it should be, a force for good, a beacon of justice." The tension in the room reached a fever pitch. The officers were divided, their loyalties torn between the old ways and the new. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from outside the precinct. The officers exchanged startled glances, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. Marcus rushed to the window and peered out. His eyes widened in horror as he saw a group of masked men armed with Molotov cocktails approaching the building. "We're under attack," he shouted, turning back to the officers. "We need to defend this precinct." The officers, their internal conflict momentarily forgotten, rallied behind Marcus. They grabbed their weapons and prepared to meet the attackers head-on. As the battle raged outside, Marcus knew that the fight for the soul of the department had just begun. The lines had been drawn, and there was no turning back. Marcus and Sarah delved deeper into the conspiracy within the department, uncovering a web of corruption that reached the highest levels. They discovered that the department's director, Mr. Stone, was not only aware of the illegal activities, but was also actively involved in them. Marcus and Sarah realized that they couldn't take on Mr. Stone alone. They needed help. They decided to reach out to a former colleague, Emily, who had been forced out of the department for speaking out against corruption. Emily was initially hesitant to get involved, but she was eventually convinced by Marcus and Sarah's passion and determination. Together, the three of them began to gather evidence of Mr. Stone's corruption. They discovered that Mr. Stone was using his position to award contracts to companies that were owned by his friends and family. They also found evidence that he was taking bribes from these companies. Marcus and Sarah knew that they had to expose Mr. Stone, but they also knew that it would be dangerous. They decided to leak their evidence to the press. The news of Mr. Stone's corruption quickly spread, and he was forced to resign. Marcus and Sarah were hailed as heroes, but they knew that their work was far from over. The department was still corrupt, and there were many other powerful people who were involved in the conspiracy. Marcus and Sarah vowed to continue their fight for justice. The precinct was a whirlwind of activity. News vans swarmed the parking lot, their satellite dishes gleaming like predatory eyes. Inside, the atmosphere crackled with a tension thicker than the summer humidity. Officers huddled in small groups, their whispers echoing off the sterile walls. Marcus, his uniform now a symbol of defiance rather than authority, stood at the center of the storm, his gaze unwavering. The investigation into the Festival of Fear incident had blown the lid off Oak Haven's festering corruption. The leaked evidence, a damning mix of body cam footage, financial records, and insider testimonies, had exposed a network of deceit that reached the highest levels of the department. The town was in an uproar, demanding accountability and justice. But the fight was far from over. The corrupt officials, backed into a corner, were lashing out. Threats had been made. Whispers of retaliation circulated like a venomous breeze. Marcus knew he was walking a dangerous line, but he refused to back down. He'd found an unexpected ally in Sarah, the teenage girl whose video had sparked the outrage. Her courage and determination had ignited a fire in Oakhaven, a collective demand for change that echoed through the streets. Together, they had become symbols of hope, beacons of light in a town shrouded in shadows. The community rallied behind them. Protests filled the streets, their chants for justice echoing through the town square. Local businesses displayed signs of solidarity, their windows adorned with messages of support. Even some of the officers within the department, inspired by Marcus's unwavering integrity, began to speak out, their voices adding fuel to the fire. The pressure mounted, the walls closing in on the corrupt officials. One by one, they crumbled, their carefully constructed facades shattering under the weight of public scrutiny. Resignations were tendered, investigations launched, and arrests made. The tide was turning, but the final showdown was yet to come. Mr. Stone, the architect of Oakhaven's corruption, remained defiant, a venomous spider clinging to the remnants of his web. He'd retreated to his opulent mansion on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a cadre of loyalists, his threats growing more desperate. Marcus knew he had to confront Stone, to end this reign of corruption once and for all. He gathered a small team of trusted officers, their faces grim but determined. They approached the mansion, the silence broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with fear and anticipation. Stone, his face pale and drawn, paced the marble floor, his voice a venomous hiss as he barked orders into the phone. He knew the game was up, but he wasn't going down without a fight. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Stone's loyalists, outnumbered and outmatched, were quickly subdued. Marcus faced Stone in the grand foyer, the chandelier casting long shadows across their faces. "It's over, Stone," Marcus said, his voice steady. "The town of Oakhaven won't be held hostage by your corruption any longer." Stone snarled, his eyes filled with hatred. "You think you've won, Thompson? This town will never change. Corruption runs deep. It's in the blood." Marcus met his gaze, his voice ringing with conviction. "Then it's time to cleanse the wound," he said, "and start anew." With Stone's arrest, a collective sigh of relief swept through Oakhaven. The reign of terror was over. But Marcus knew this was just the beginning. The scars of corruption ran deep, and the fight for true justice and equality was far from over. But as he looked out at the faces of the townspeople, their eyes filled with hope and gratitude, he knew that Oakhaven had a chance to heal, to rebuild, to become a beacon of light, not just for its residents, but for the nation. The dust settled in Oakhaven, leaving behind a town transformed. The scars of the past remained, etched into the collective memory, but a new spirit of hope and resilience had taken root. The Festival of Fear incident, once a symbol of injustice and oppression, had become a catalyst for change, a turning point in the town's history. Marcus, no longer the rookie chief, stood tall, his leadership forged in the fires of adversity. He'd proven himself not just as a law enforcer, but as a beacon of integrity, a champion of justice. The department, once riddled with corruption, was slowly healing, its ranks filled with officers who shared Marcus's vision of a community built on trust and respect. Jamal, his wounds healing, had become a symbol of resilience, his voice rising above the whispers of fear and doubt. He returned to his studies with renewed determination, his dream of becoming a lawyer burning brighter than ever. He vowed to use his experience to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves, to ensure that no one else would suffer the injustice he had endured. Sarah, the quiet girl who had sparked a revolution with her video, blossomed into a confident young woman. She continued to use her voice to advocate for change, her social media platforms becoming a powerful tool for justice and accountability. She inspired others to speak up, to challenge the status quo, to demand a better future for their community. The town square, once a stage for public humiliation, was now a gathering place for healing and unity. The old oak trees, silent witnesses to Oakhaven's darkest hour, now stood tall, their branches reaching towards a brighter horizon. The fight for justice was far from over. The deep-rooted prejudices and systemic inequalities that had plagued Oakhaven for generations wouldn't disappear overnight. But the seeds of change had been sown, and a new generation of leaders was rising, determined to create a community where everyone felt safe, respected, and valued. Marcus, Jamal, and Sarah, their paths forever intertwined by the events of that fateful summer, stood together, their gazes fixed on the future. They knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but they were ready to face it, united in their commitment to a better Oakhaven, a town where justice prevailed and hope triumphed over fear. The legacy of the Festival of Fear would forever be etched in Oakhaven's history, a reminder of the darkness that had once consumed the town. But it would also be a testament to the power of courage, resilience, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. A new legacy was being forged, one that would inspire generations to come, a legacy of hope, healing, and the enduring belief in the power of change.